Good day, everyone, and welcome to Quest for Alpha. Almost a decade ago, I became obsessed with two words: financial freedom. Looking back, I think those two words changed the trajectory of my life for the better, but they also quietly took something away from me. And I did not realize this until years later. At the time, I didn't even know what financial freedom actually meant. Did it mean having millions of dollars? Did it mean retiring at 40? Perhaps living somewhere inexpensive instead of the northeast part of the US, like New York City, Boston? I honestly couldn't define it, but I didn't need to. Those two words represented something much bigger: a choice. For the first time, I realized there might be another way to live life, a life where I could choose what I worked on, where I lived, and how I spent my time. Looking back, I don't think I was chasing money. I was really chasing optionality. And money just seemed to be the ticket. Like many engineers, I approached the problem the way I would approach any other problem that's very difficult. I looked for someone who had already solved something similar. And that seemed rational. I had a demanding career. I wanted to be a good husband. Eventually, I wanted to be a good father. I didn't have 10 hours a day to reinvent the wheel. So I learned from people who appear to have already reached financial freedom. I bought few courses, I read the books, watched hundreds of hours of YouTube, and I tested many different strategies. I backtested, I tweaked, I optimized, and over roughly 7, 8 years, I probably spent less than $10,000. If you were expecting me to tell you I lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, well, you're going to be disappointed, because the money wasn't the expensive part. Every few months, I would convince myself that I had finally found it. I had found the strategy, the vehicle. And then a few months later, I would move on. Not always because I failed. Sometimes it actually worked, but it did not work for my life and lifestyle. Some of the people I followed could spend 10 or 12 hours a day watching the markets. Some didn't have demanding careers, some did not have children, and some had already built enough wealth that teaching became their business. There was nothing wrong with what they were doing. They were simply solving a different problem. And somehow I kept trying to force their solution onto my life. There is something almost embarrassing about that, because as engineers, we are taught never to copy a design without understanding the constraints that it was designed for. Every solution is optimized for a specific environment. A bridge, for example, that's designed for one river doesn't automatically work on another. Yet I completely ignored this principle when I was designing my own life. I wasn't borrowing knowledge. I was borrowing conclusions. I was borrowing timelines. I was borrowing goals. I was borrowing someone else's definition of freedom. And I was trying to make it fit a life that looked nothing like mine. So the biggest cost wasn't money. It wasn't failed trades. It wasn't bad courses. It was my attention. Sometimes I'd be sitting with my wife, and the moment she would look away, I'd quickly check the charts. Sometimes I'd wait until she went to bed so I could spend a few more minutes alone with the markets or reading about a potential side business I could start. Not because I love looking at candles, because I honestly believe that freedom might be just one strategy or one system away. Now, looking back, I wasn't losing evenings to trading. I was mentally escaping the very life I had worked so hard to build. That sentence is difficult for me to admit, because objectively, I already had so much. I had a career I was proud of, a wonderful life, a wonderful wife, good health, friends, opportunities. Yet, I had convinced myself that life would only truly begin once I reached this imaginary destination called financial freedom. I think a lot of ambitious people do this. We become so focused on optimizing the tomorrow that we quietly stop living today. Then a few years later, my son was born and something unexpected happened. I stopped searching. I was dedicated my time to raising my child and being together with him and my wife. And it was during this time that instead of consuming, I started reflecting and I started asking different questions. For almost a decade, I kept asking, who has the answer? Then I started asking, what kind of life am I actually trying to build? And that question changed everything, because once I answered it, I realized I didn't actually want someone else's life. I wanted my own. Today, I still learn from people, probably more than ever, but I no longer copy answers. I study how people think. And then I ask whether those ideas fit the constraints of my own life. And that's a completely different process. And, strangely enough, that's also how engineers solve problems. These days, I don't define financial freedom in the same way. Many, many years ago, I thought that freedom meant never having to work again. Today, I don't want to stop working. I love creating, I love building businesses, I love making these videos, and I love solving difficult problems. Work isn't the enemy. Working on things that don't matter to you is. And today, freedom means something much simpler. It means choosing what I build, choosing where I live, and choosing how I spend my mornings, for example. Having enough time to sit on the floor and play with my son without feeling guilty that I should be doing something else. Having enough freedom to spend months living in another country if that's what my family wants. To me, that is true wealth. So if I could go back a decade ago or 7 years ago, I wouldn't tell myself, stop learning from other people. Learning from others is one of the fastest ways to grow, but I would tell myself something I now believe applies to almost every important decision in life, that every solution is designed around certain constraints. There is a career, a family, personality, goals and objectives, and tolerance for risk, depending on which stage of life you're in. If you ignore those constraints, you may end up spending years trying to solve the wrong problem. For me, 7 years ago, I thought the answer was hidden inside another strategy, another course, perhaps another mentor. Today, I still look for teachers, but I no longer ask them how to live. I ask them how they think, because eventually every one of us has to design a life around our constraints. No one else can do this for us. And maybe that's what financial freedom really became for me. Not the freedom to stop working, but the freedom to stop chasing someone else's version of success and instead start building my own. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, consider subscribing to this channel and hit the like button. And I'll see you in the next one.